just want to encourage you to forgive. Oh my goodness. Forgiveness isn't for the other person, it's for yourself.
She was killed simply because she was too holy. In a world filled with violence and hate, the idea of someone losing their life because of their faith, their character, or their values is almost unthinkable. Yet, for a young woman named Shaliyah Collins, this cruel reality became the ending of her story. This is not just another murder. It's a chilling reminder of how dangerous resentment can become when someone chooses to hate what they cannot understand, or despise what they cannot match. And caught in this storm of senseless violence was another soul, Phillip Mock, a man who had no quarrel in this story, no role to play in the hatred that brewed. His only crime was being a Good Samaritan, a man willing to extend a hand of help, without knowing that help would lead him into the same deadly crossfire. Tonight, in this case, we explore two lives, one targeted for being faithful and another taken for being kind. On October 28, 2023, the quiet of Savannah, Georgia, was shattered. What began as just another day ended in unimaginable violence on the Truman Parkway. By the time the gunfire stopped, Shaliyah Collins was gone. Phillip Mock, too, had lost his life, and the killer, later identified as Derek Johnson, would be hunted down across state lines before being captured. But at the heart of this case lies a question that shakes the very core of our humanity. Why would anyone decide to kill another human being simply because of their faith? And another question follows just as urgently. How do we balance the goodness of helping others with the wisdom of knowing when and how to help? These are the themes we will unravel tonight. Welcome to True Crime Cave, your ultimate hideout for chilling true crime stories, unsolved mysteries, and the darkest realities of human nature. Here, we don't just recount crimes. We go deeper. We examine the minds behind them, the lives lost to them, and the lessons they leave behind for all of us. So, if you haven't already, subscribe and join our growing community of true crime thinkers and explorers. Because in this cave, we don't just tell stories. We search for the truths that haunt them. Stay with me, because in the next couple minutes, we will peel back the layers of this case. The life of Shaliyah Collins, a woman whose light was deemed too holy by her killer, the twisted resentment that fueled Derek Johnson, and the tragic fate of Phillip Mock, a Good Samaritan who stepped in to help, only to pay the ultimate price. This is a story of faith, hate, kindness, and tragedy. And it begins right now. When we talk about true crime, it's easy to get lost in the details of the violence, the motives of the killer, or the shocking twist of the case. But tonight, before we talk about guns, before we talk about the manhunt, and before we dissect the killer, we need to stop. We need to remember the person at the very center of the story, the victim, Shaliyah Collins. Because this isn't just a crime story. This was her life. Shaliyah was known in her community as a young woman of faith. To her friends and family, she was more than just another name on the news. She was a daughter, a loved one, a believer. Those who knew her describe her as kind, compassionate, and respectful, a young woman with a presence that radiated goodness. People who came across Shaliyah often remember her not for anything flashy, not for anything boastful, but for her faith. She was the type of person who tried to live in line with what she believed. Someone who wasn't afraid to be different in a world that often rewards compromise. For some, her faith was admirable. For others, it was intimidating. Faith shaped Shaliyah's life in ways that were visible to everyone around her. She was the kind of person who would check on you if you were going through something. The kind of person who would remind you of hope when life felt hopeless. Her kindness wasn't performance. It was who she was at her core. And yet, it was this very faith, this very devotion to goodness, that drew the darkest kind of hatred from a man who would eventually take her life. Derek Johnson reportedly told others that Shaliyah was too holy. He saw her faith not as a light to admire, but as something that irritated him, something he despised. It is a chilling thought that living a life of kindness and conviction could make someone a target. Friends and family remember Shaliyah as someone who smiled easily. She was warm, approachable, and genuine. In a time when many young people are consumed with self-image and competition, Shaliyah stood out for her simplicity. She carried herself with quiet confidence, rooted in something deeper than appearances. She was the kind of person who didn't just talk about faith. She lived it. She embodied it. And that authenticity, that refusal to be anything other than herself, was both her strength and, tragically, the reason she was targeted. Every life that is cut short leaves behind a trail of dreams unfulfilled. Shaliyah was no exception. She had aspirations for her future, plans to grow, to contribute, to build. Reports and social media tributes reveal that she was working toward her goals, carving out a life for herself while staying grounded in her beliefs. For her family, these dreams are now memories of what could have been. For her community, her loss is a reminder that every act of violence doesn't just end a life. It erases a future. Shaliyah wasn't someone who lived in isolation. She was present in her community, whether through church, social circles, or everyday interactions. She left an impression. People who spoke after her death describe her as someone with a strong moral compass, someone you could look up to. It's no wonder that when the news of her murder broke, shockwaves ran through Savannah. To many, it didn't seem possible. How could someone who lived with so much grace become the victim of such brutality? Why too holy? The phrase "too holy" became the twisted justification for her murder. Think about that for a moment. In a society where we often say we want people to be kind, respectful, and grounded, Shaliyah embodied all of that. Yet to her killer, her goodness was unbearable. Her faith was an offense. There is something deeply unsettling about this motive, because it forces us to confront a darker truth, that sometimes evil doesn't attack because of wrongdoing. Sometimes it attacks because of righteousness. And so I ask you, as you listen to this story, have you ever been criticized for your faith, for your values, for simply trying to live a good life? Now, imagine that criticism growing into resentment. Imagine that resentment growing into hatred. And imagine that hatred deciding that you do not deserve to live. That is the horror of Shaliyah's story. We've looked not at the crime, not at the killer, but at the woman whose life was stolen. Because if we forget who Shaliyah Collins was, if we reduce her to just a victim, we lose the very reason this story matters. Her life meant more than words on a page or numbers in a report. She was a person, a believer, a daughter, a light. And it was that light, the very thing that made her stand out, that drew the darkness of Derek Johnson's hatred. And as we move forward, we will begin to uncover more about the man who decided that faith was a crime worth killing for. Johnson carried a past marked by crime and conflict. Court records and police reports reveal a troubled man with a history that painted the picture of someone deeply at odds with society and with himself. He had been entangled with the law before. His name was not unknown to law enforcement in Georgia. Those who knew him describe a man with issues of anger and volatility, someone whose actions were unpredictable, often guided by resentment rather than reason. Unlike Shaliyah, who was grounded in faith and kindness, Johnson's path was marked by bitterness and hostility. And here's the question for you. Have you ever met someone who seemed irritated not because you wronged them, but simply because you lived differently from them? Someone whose resentment grew just because your light exposed their darkness? That's the kind of man Johnson was. Johnson had been arrested multiple times before the events of October 2023. His criminal history included charges that spoke of violence, poor decision-making, and inability to control impulses. Though the specifics of every case may not all be publicly detailed, the pattern was clear. Johnson is definitely not a stranger to trouble. When someone has a repeated history of violence, It reveals not just a string of bad choices, but a mindset, a way of living that leans into destruction rather than building. This was the path Johnson had chosen for himself long before he crossed paths with Shaliyah. What drives a man to murder someone simply because of faith? To understand Johnson, we have to look at his state of mind. Reports and witness accounts suggest that Johnson resented Shaliyah's character. He reportedly considered her too holy. These two words reveal far more than they seem. In them, we see a heart that is both faithless and hostile to faith itself. For someone consumed with anger, a person living in light becomes a mirror, reflecting back what they lack, exposing the emptiness inside them, instead of turning inward to fix his own brokenness. Johnson chose to lash outward in his state of mind. Shaliyah's faith did not come off as an inspiration. It was an irritation. Her goodness did not challenge him to rise higher. It provoked him to sink lower. Hatred toward people of faith is not new. History is filled with stories of those who despise believers, not because of crime, not because of wrongdoing, but simply because faith shines a light where darkness prefers to hide. Johnson's resentment was personal. To him, Shaliyah represented something he could not stand. She embodied consistency, conviction, and peace, the very things missing from his own chaotic life. Some people cannot tolerate the presence of someone who refuses to compromise. And for Johnson, the only way to silence that reminder was through violence. Investigations revealed that Johnson was no stranger to rage. Those who crossed paths with men like him often described sudden outbursts, unpredictable tempers, and an unwillingness to take accountability. Shaliyah's holiness became, in his eyes, an insult. His pride turned her goodness into provocation. This is a twisted logic of hate. It takes something pure and redefines it as a threat. Intolerance does not explode overnight. It festers. It grows in silence until it erupts. Johnson's resentment toward faith had been building, unaddressed, feeding on his anger and bitterness. When intolerance is left unchecked, it becomes dangerous. It blinds a person from seeing the humanity of others. Shaliyah was no longer a young woman with dreams, family, and a future. In his eyes, she became a target, someone to destroy simply because her life reminded him of what he refused to accept. When we compare the lives of Shaliyah Collins and Derek Johnson, the contrast is stark. On one side, light, a woman living with faith, kindness, and integrity. On the other side, darkness, a man consumed by bitterness, crime, and hatred. This is not just a story about a crime. It is a story about what happens when light and darkness collide. Shaliyah's light shone too brightly for Johnson's darkness to endure. Instead of seeking that light, he chose to extinguish it. By October 28th, 2023, these two lives, so different in character, so opposite in direction, would intersect. Shaliyah, innocent and faithful. Johnson, bitter and hostile. The stage was set for tragedy. And as we move into the day of the murder, we see how Johnson's hatred, built over years of resentment, finally erupted in violence. But before we recount the crime itself, we must remember, this crime came with purpose, not randomness. It was a result of a heart hardened by anger, a mind clouded by resentment, and a soul at war with light. This is how intolerance becomes murder. When tragedy strikes, it often claims more than one victim. In this story, 2 lives were lost, not just one. Alongside Shaliyah Collins, there was another name, a man whose only mistake was stepping in to help. That man was Phillip Mock. Phillip was not a celebrity, not a politician, not someone with power or influence. He was, in many ways, an ordinary man. But isn't it often true that ordinary people do extraordinary things? From accounts that followed his death, Phillip was remembered as someone willing to help others, someone who believed in doing the right thing, a man who didn't stand by when trouble unfolded. And that's how we must understand him, not just as another victim, but as a Good Samaritan. Imagine the scene. A young woman is in distress. She is being confronted, harassed, and threatened. Many people in today's world would turn away. They would say, "That's not my problem." But Philip did not. What makes someone stop? What makes someone get involved, even when danger looms? For Philip, it was character. A simple but profound belief. If someone is in trouble, you don't walk away. You step forward. And in that moment, Philip became what so few are willing to be, a protector. Philip's story forces us to ask ourselves, what would we do if you saw someone in danger, someone who would lose their life? Would you intervene? Would you take that risk? We'd all like to say yes. We'd like to believe we'd be brave enough. But in reality, many turn away. Philip didn't. He chose to be the everyday hero. The kind of man who doesn't wear a cape, doesn't have superpowers, but whose moral compass compels him to act. And sometimes, those are the greatest heroes of all. The idea of helping others runs deep in human history. Every culture, every religion, every philosophy has a version of this principle. The Bible speaks of the Good Samaritan, the traveler who stopped to help a man left for dead when others pass him by. Philip's actions reflected that same spirit. He didn't know Shaliyah. He didn't know her anything. But kindness doesn't always wait for obligation. Sometimes it is instinctive. And yet, here lies the tragedy. In helping, he placed himself in the crosshairs of violence. History reminds us that not all acts of intervention end in gratitude. There are countless cases of men and women who stepped in to help and paid the ultimate price. Some were caught in robberies, others in domestic disputes, others, like Philip, in confrontations where anger and hate spiraled out of control. It is one of the cruelest truths of life that sometimes the good suffer for their goodness. And yet, would the world be better if no one helped? If we all turned away? If we all chose silence in the face of wrong? On that night in October 2023, Phillip Mock stepped forward. He saw what was happening to Shaliyah. He understood that silence was not an option. He chose to intervene. But his path tragically crossed with Derek Johnson's rage. What was meant to be an act of kindness became an act of sacrifice. Philip's bravery did not go unnoticed, but it cost him his life. He became a casualty, not because he did wrong, but because he did right in the presence of evil. And now, let me ask you, what we do with stories like this? Do they warn us against helping? Do they tell us to stay away, to remain silent, to mind our business? Or do they challenge us to be wise, but still courageous, to know that helping others, though risky, is part of what makes us human? Philip's story leaves us with that tension. It reminds us that it is good to help, but it is also wise to discern when and how. But above all, it reminds us that true heroes are not defined by safety. They are defined by sacrifice. Phillip Mock's life intersected with Shaliyah Collins's in the unlikeliest of ways. Two strangers brought together by violence. One targeted for her faith. The other killed for his kindness. Together, their deaths tell a story bigger than themselves. A story about light versus darkness. About faith and hatred. About kindness and cruelty. As we move into the next part of the story, we arrive at the moment where everything unfolded. The crime itself. The night of October 28th, when light and darkness collided and tragedy struck. October 28th, 2023. It was a Saturday night in Savannah, Georgia. For many, it was just another evening. Families were gathered at home. Cars hummed along the Truman Parkway. Life moved on, as it always does. But for two innocent people, this night will become their final chapter. According to reports, it all began with a confrontation. At the center of it was Derek Johnson, a man already known for violence and hostility. That night, his anger turned toward Shaliyah Collins. Why? Because of who she was. Because of her faith. Because she carried herself with a kind of light he despised. To him, she was, in his own cruel judgment, too holy. And for that, he decided she had to die. Witnesses and police records paint a chilling picture. Shots rang out near the Truman Parkway. In seconds, the air was split by violence. Shaliyah was struck. Her life, the dream she carried, the kindness she embodied, was cut short by bullets driven by hate. But the violence didn't end there. Nearby was Phillip Mock. He wasn't a relative. He wasn't part of the argument. He wasn't supposed to be a target that night. But when he saw Shaliyah's life in danger, he stepped forward. Phillip acted as so many of us hoped someone would if it were our own daughter, our own sister, our own friend being attacked. He tried to intervene. He tried to protect. But in doing so, he placed himself directly in the path of Darasol's fury. Phillip, the Good Samaritan, was gunned down as well. 2 lives ended within moments, one because of faith, the other because of kindness. Those who were nearby described chaos. Gunfire in the night, panic in the streets, people running, ducking for cover, trying to make sense of what was happening. Imagine it. You're driving home along the Truman Parkway. Suddenly, you hear shots. You see cars stopping, people screaming. You realize that a man's hatred has turned the night into a crime scene. Police sirens tore through the night soon after. The flashing lights, the officers rushing in. But by the time help arrived, it was too late for Shaliyah and Phillip. Their lives had already been taken. According to official reports from the Savannah Police Department, both victims were found shot and killed along Truman Parkway. Investigators quickly identified the suspect, Derek Johnson. Authorities later revealed that Derek Johnson previously had a bond with Shaliyah. There existed a prior connection. Family accounts identify him as a stepfather of her boyfriend. This detail changed the way many in the community understood the tragedy. Shaliyah had accepted rides from him before, believing she could trust him. That history of familiarity is what made the events of that night even more chilling. Because this was not the danger of a dark alley or a faceless predator. It was betrayal by someone who, through family ties, should have been a source of safety. And it is here that we turn to what followed, the investigation, the manhunt, and the arrest of Derek Johnson. Because evil can run, but justice always chases. When the gunfire stopped on that October night, silence fell heavy on the Truman Parkway. 2 lives have been stolen. But for the Savannah Police Department, silence is not the end point. Justice had to speak. Immediately after the shootings, detectives and officers swarmed the scene. Evidence markers lined the ground. Sirens echoed, and investigators began piecing together what had happened. Witnesses came forward, frightened, shaken, but willing to speak. And from those testimonies, one name rose quickly to the surface. It wasn't just about identifying who pulled the trigger. It was about finding him fast. Because a man capable of killing over faith and targeting a Good Samaritan was a man who posed a danger to anyone in his path. Within hours, the search for Darasol stretched beyond Savannah. Detectives worked through the night, running down leads, tracking his movements. By the next day, October 29th, the manhunt was in full swing. Police alerts were issued. Tips flowed in. The community was asked to remain vigilant. For the families of Shaliyah and Phillip, those hours were excruciating. Grief and anger mixed with fear. Would this man be caught? Would justice find him? The breakthrough came quickly. By October 30th, 2023, just 2 days after the shootings, news broke. Derek Johnson had been captured. He was located in Florida, far from the streets of Savannah, where his crimes were committed. The arrest was the result of coordination between Georgia authorities and law enforcement agencies across state lines. It was a reminder that while criminals may try to run, the law runs faster. For the families, the news brought some measure of relief, but also a reminder of their loss. No arrest, no matter how swift, could bring back Shaliyah. No handcuffs could restore Phillip. But at least the man responsible would face justice. When the arrest was announced, Savannah breathed differently. There was grief, yes, but also gratitude. Gratitude that a dangerous man was no longer free. Gratitude that the system had worked swiftly. Law enforcement officials released statements affirming their commitment to the families. They called the murders senseless. They promised to pursue the case with every resource available. And in churches, in living rooms, and on social media, the community reacted. Many expressed heartbreak. Others voiced outrage. But there was a common thread. The city mourned together. Vigils were held. Candles lit the night in memory of Shaliyah and Phillip. Strangers embraced, united by sorrow. Prayers rose for the victims and their families. And alongside the mourning came outrage. How could this happen? How could someone decide to kill a young woman because she was too holy? How could an act of kindness cost a man his life? The community asked these questions, not because answers were easy, but because silence was impossible. Let me ask you this. How does a community heal from something like this? How do families carry on when their loved ones are taken not by accident, but by choice, by hate, by violence, by evil? Justice may catch the killer. Courts may decide his fate. But for those left behind, justice is never enough. Because true justice would be Shaliyah alive. True justice would be Phillip alive. And that is something no manhunt, no trial, no sentence can ever give back. And so, by October 30th, the man behind the Truman Parkway shootings was in custody. The first chapter of justice had been written, but the story wasn't over. Because the aftermath of murder is more than police reports and arrests. It's about the families, the community, and the haunting lessons left behind. As we move forward, we turn to those lessons, the reflections that this tragedy forces us to face. About faith, about kindness, about violence, and about the choices each of us make in the face of evil. When we step back from the Truman Parkway, when we step back from the flashing lights, the crime scene tape, the grief-filled faces, we begin to see something larger. Because this tragedy went beyond one man's violence. It went beyond 2 stolen lives. It revealed a bigger picture. Themes of faith, intolerance, kindness, and the risks we face in a world where light and darkness constantly collide. Faith and violence theme. History tells us that people of faith, those who carry themselves with conviction, kindness, or even quiet morality, have often been targeted. Sometimes for their beliefs, sometimes for their refusal to compromise, sometimes simply because their light is too bright for others to endure. Shaliyah Collins was described by those who knew her as faithful, kind, grounded in her spirituality. For her, faith meant more than just words, it was life. And tragically, that very faith, that very holiness, became the excuse for someone else's hate. And this is not an isolated story. Across the world and across history, countless lives have been lost because others could not tolerate difference. Because some see goodness not as inspiration, but as threat. It is a dangerous truth that resentment of faith or virtue, when left unchecked, festers into anger, and that anger, in hearts unrestrained, becomes violence. Let me ask you this. Have you ever been criticized for your values? For standing by your convictions, even when it made you different? Now imagine that criticism multiplied into hatred. So deep, so irrational, that someone decides you don't deserve to live. That was Shaliyah's reality. And it is a chilling reminder of why intolerance must never be ignored. Then we turn to Phillip Mock. His story adds another layer to the bigger picture, the theme of helping others. Throughout history, countless Good Samaritans have stepped into dangerous moments. Some saved lives and became heroes. Others, like Phillip, paid with their own. There are stories of strangers pulling victims from burning cars, of bystanders stepping into violent disputes, of neighbors rushing to protect children in danger. These stories inspire us. They remind us of the best of humanity. But there are also stories where intervention ends in tragedy, where the noble act of helping is met with violence, where kindness is punished by cruelty. And Philip's story fits here. His gesture cannot just be termed reckless. It was compassionate. It was what many of us hope we would do. And yet, it cost him everything. So what do we learn? Do we say it's better not to help? Do we turn away when someone is in need? No, because if no one helps, evil wins by silence. But Philip's death does teach us something crucial, that kindness must also carry wisdom. To help is good. To help wisely is better. Wisdom asks us to look at the situation, to consider the risks, to act with courage but also with awareness. Because in a world where danger hides in unexpected places, helping recklessly can sometimes multiply tragedy. Philip's legacy is not one of mistake. It is one of sacrifice. His story reminds us that the decision to help is never simple. It requires not just heart, but discernment. And so, when we look at the bigger picture, the Truman Parkway shootings are not only about a killer and his hate. They are about faith targeted by violence. They are about kindness caught in the crossfire. They are about the fragile line between good and evil and the choices we make when faced with it. Shaliyah's faith cost her life. Philip's kindness cost his. And together, their stories call us to reflect on how we treat people of faith, on how we help others, and on how we carry light in a world that too often chooses darkness. As we come to the end of this story, let us pause, not on the violence, not on the man who pulled the trigger, but on the lives that mattered, honoring Shaliyah Collins. Shaliyah Collins was more than a victim. She was a young woman with dreams, with kindness, with faith that defined her. To those who knew her, she was light. She was encouragement. She was someone whose very presence lifted others up. And that's what makes her death so heartbreaking. Because she wasn't caught in random crossfire. She wasn't a nameless face in a statistic. She was targeted. She was silenced because she dared to live by her faith. But even though the bullets took her life, they did not erase her legacy. Her faith still speaks. Her kindness still echoes. Her story still challenges us to stand strong, even when the world despises holiness. Remembering Phillip Mock. And then we remember Phillip Mock, a man who, in the simplest sense, chose to help. He didn't know Shaliyah personally. He had no obligation to step in, but his heart told him he couldn't just watch. Philip became the Good Samaritan of this story. He stood up when others might have stood back. And though his life ended in tragedy, his death held purpose even in tragedy. Because Philip's story reminds us of both the nobility and the danger of kindness. It tells us that good still exists in a world consumed by selfishness. But it also warns us that good must walk carefully, because evil does not hesitate to strike. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you take away from Shaliyah's story? What does Philip's sacrifice say to you about the world we live in? Share your thoughts, your reflections, maybe even your own experiences in the comments below. If this case has moved you or made you think, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, not just to follow the stories we tell, but to be part of a community that remembers the victims, learns from the past, and talks honestly about how we move forward. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who might find encouragement or reflection in it, share this video with them. Let Shaliyah's light and Philip's courage ripple outward. And so, as we close, we leave with this truth. Shaliyah's light was silenced by hate, but her story reminds us that faith, kindness, and wisdom must never die. Because as long as we remember her, as long as we honor Philip, as long as we choose tolerance over hate and courage over silence, the darkness will never fully win. This has been True Crime Cave. Thank you for walking through this story with me tonight. If it moved you, if it made you reflect, if it reminded you of the fragile line between good and evil, then I ask you, share it, speak about it, and most of all, let it change the way you live. Until next time, stay safe, stay wise, and keep the light alive.